Here we are generating the resource or module for auth and similarly for users. Once the modules are generated, we will be adding them in app.module.ts along with the entities that are required. Adding required entities in app module. Importing entities here. Now we will be installing all the packages we mentioned earlier. This installation will take a while. After scaffolding auth and users, just like part 6, we can create DTOs and entities. For user, I've created user entity with decorators from type ORM and class validator. In this particular case, I've decorated class user or the DTO user with unique. This decorator takes in username and it tells that the username will remain unique in this class. So when we will be storing it in database, each record will have a unique username. We will be using email as a username here, and then we have the password here. Each of these fields will be decorated with @ column from type ORM, and the primary key is decorated with primary generated column, and it will be automatically generating UUID as an identifier in the database. Attributing the user class with entity, also providing a default value for update in mail. Here we have the create user data transfer object that will help us in terms of creating users, and then we have update user DTO that is derived from create user DTO. This entire arrangement is just like what we have done in part 6. The service class for the users is pretty similar to what we have used earlier, and here we have all the CRUD and find one to read one record based on the username string here, and we will be using it for fetching the user based on name for password comparison. And then we have this create method to create or register a new user. We are hashing our password before we store it into our database. The one important thing to note here is that you can use the bcrypt package, but that will not work in 2024 in containerized environment. If you like to containerize your API, then in that case, it is better to use JS version of the library. If we go to update, we have an update method here, and then we have find all. Then we have user controller, and here we have like all the CRUDs that are delegating call to the user service, and user service is injected by NESTJS module and dependency injection engine into this controller. In our module class, we are actually importing the type ORM, and then we are having controllers here and user service as a service provider, and we are also exporting user service to be used by other classes. Then we have auth module here, and this auth module is actually helping us out in authenticating the user. Also helps us in generating the JWT tokens that we can use with endpoint calls. Service class is pretty similar. Here we have two methods. That one method is validate user. This allows us to validate user using username and password. It uses the user service from the user module, and we have just seen that user module exports the user service. We can find the user that is passed, and I can always remove this. Then we are encrypting the username and then comparing it with the password that was encrypted and stored in the database. And if the comparison is successful, then we can send out the result by separating the password from it. If it fails, it will return the null. We are using the passport library that we imported here. The login method here will be called after validation, and this method will be responsible for creating JWT access token and refresh token that we can use to regenerate access tokens if they expire. In this particular part, I will not be using refresh token. We have already used this concept in earlier parts of the series. If we go to the controller class here, login method available here that takes in the request and it calls the auth service login that return different tokens. And you can also notice that it is decorated with use cards auth card local. And as I'm using the passport services or passportjs for authentication, I'm using this auth card. To explain this functionality, I need to go through the whole security ecosystem for NESTJS and passportjs. So I'll not be explaining the passport.js itself, but to make passport.js work, we need a couple of strategies here that how we actually authenticate our users, how we validate our user, and how we can send back JWT tokens and how we can configure them to work with our endpoints. So in this case, we have a local strategy here that is a part of passport.js ecosystem, and we are driving a local strategy class from passport strategy. In this case, we are constructor injecting the auth service, and then we have a validate method that takes in two parameters, username and password. And here we are calling the validate user method that we just visited in auth service.ts. And we are passing in the username and password that will be actually hashed and compared with the database value. And in case it is successful, we will return the user, otherwise we will throw the exception. We are performing the validation here for local strategy. We have the JWT strategy here that is quite similar, that it is derived from the passport strategy, and it's calling the base class constructor to pass in some extra information like where we expect token whenever we call a REST endpoint. In this case, it will be auth header, and we have to extract our bearer token from auth header. And then we have ignore expiration that is set to false, and then secret or key that contains this is my secret. The best place to store all these secrets is .env file, and even better place is to store in a key store, just like that we have done in our earlier parts. Then we have a validate method here, and here we are returning some information like username and user ID. So this strategy will be used for handling and generating tokens. Both local strategy and JWT strategy will be used with the decorator. Here I have JWT auth card class that I'm driving from auth card and passing in JWT. This JWT will implicitly link it with our JWT strategy, and we will be using it in our controllers. So let's see that how we can use this. If you go to the controller class, we can see that to use cards is using the auth card with local, and this local will automatically link it with local strategy and allow us to validate our user. Once the user is validated, then this login method will call auth service login that will help us issuing the token. And we have already seen this here, and here we are actually getting our tokens. Now the question arises that where we will be using our JWT strategy. The answer to that is simple, that if we go to any of our endpoints, for example, we go to our customer endpoint that we created in part 6 and go to the controller, here we can use that JWT auth card to protect this endpoint. So we can either use this decorator at class level, or we can also use it at particular endpoint level. In this case, I want to protect all the endpoints, so I am putting this use guard on top of the class. And all of these CRUD methods here, create, find all, find one, update, delete, they will all be guarded by this JWT auth card, and it will facilitate token validation. I have changed Docker Compose file into a simpler form where I'm just running Postgres server. So my Postgres server is up and running. I have changed just client HTTP here. Here I have this endpoint HTTP localhost 3000 v1 API users, and here I'm providing an information about full name, username, password. Let's change the name here. Calling the endpoint. Now this time it is 201 created, and I have this encrypted password which I should not return, but I'm returning for this example. My next step is to log into this service, and for that purpose I'll be using alphabetaexample.com. I have got the access token here, copying it, and my customer endpoints are all secure. Here I am, and I'll be replacing this token with the token I just received. If I send in a request without a bearer token, then I'll receive 401 unauthorized. So I am sending in a get for this particular customer's endpoint to get all the customers. And in this case, I'm getting 401 unauthorized. Now I'm pasting the token here, and I'm sending the request to get all the customers with 200 OK and a list of customers. And in case if I try to change this token or make it deformed, what will happen? I'll get 401 unauthorized. Since we are not implementing a refresh strategy, so this token will live for given time, we completed implementation of securing endpoints for our NESTJS REST API. We will be using this REST API in our next episode, and we will use it in a front-end application developed using React.js.